Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 11, you have the death of Abraham. We looked at that 2 weeks ago. We especially zeroed in on verse 8. Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man, satisfied or full, and he was gathered to his people. We talked about how that expression there, gathered to his people, is an indication of not of his physical body being buried, but his spirit going to the realm of the dead, into the realm of Hades. So he was gathered to his people in the sense of when he breathed his last, his soul or spirit departed from his body, and he went to paradise. And the reason why we know he's in paradise is because of Luke chapter 16. In the Jewish way of describing the afterlife, the good part of afterlife that you go to, it was described as Abraham's bosom. And we see in Luke chapter 16 what Jesus said about Abraham was there with Lazarus in that teaching that he was giving, who had died, who was a poor beggar, died, his spirit went to paradise or Abraham's bosom, and you have Abraham on the side of paradise in a separation or a gulf, a fixed gulf, and then on the other side there is torment where the rich man went. And you see the rich man speaking to and identifying Abraham over in paradise. So we know that Abraham, when he died, he went to paradise. This tells us here, even in the earliest revelation of God's Word, that the spirit survives the death of the body. You don't go extinct when you die. You don't cease to exist when you die. There are religious groups out there that say that happens, and they try to use passages from the Bible to say you go to sleep or you cease to exist when you die, but that's just not the case. He was gathered to his people indicates he went to a different place. His body went to the tomb. His spirit went to paradise. And so he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, verse 9, there with his wife. And it says in verse 11, and it came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived in Beer Lahai. So here you have in verses 12 through 18 a giving of the descendants, or the record of the generations. Verse 12 says, of the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. Verses 19 through 34, you see the record of the descendants of Abraham through Isaac. Remember that Isaac is the chosen seed. He is the next generation in the special blessing that was given to Abraham. It originated with Abraham. It was passed on to Isaac. And it will eventually go down to Jacob. And so you have the generation of the record in verse 12. You have the names of the children of Ishmael listed. It says in verse 16, these are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their camps, 12 princesses according to their tribes. So it was promised of Ishmael that he would grow into a people, that his descendants would grow. And sure enough, it did happen. He was not going to be the one that would be the promised seed, that would be the one that brought about Christ into the world. But he was blessed because he came from Abraham. Verse 17, these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. Again, gathered to his people. Verse 18, they settled from Havilah in Shur, which is east of Egypt, as one goes towards Assyria, and he settled in defiance of all his relatives. It was going to be a conflict. It was said that there would be a conflict, Genesis 16 and verse 12, between Ishmael's people and Abraham's people. And of course, that did take place. Look at verse 19. Now these are the records of the generation of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. See, we've already looked at that in chapter 24. And what the Bible sometimes does, it kind of does a recap. It'll go back over and do kind of a recap of something that it's already discussed, or it might go into a detailed discussion of something that it's already discussed. And so it's kind of giving, here are the descendants of Abraham through two of his sons, through Ishmael and through Isaac. And we already learned how Rebekah and Isaac met one another. Verse 21, it says, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, it's very interesting here that Rebekah was barren for a time. Remember, Sarah was barren for a time. Well, here Rebekah is barren for a time, and Isaac prays, and the Lord hears and answers him, and Rebekah conceives. His wife conceives, verse 22, and the children struggle together within her, and she says, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Now, what is the significance of verse 22 concerning the things that we face in, as far as issues in our modern society? What struggled within her in her womb? What do you have in your womb when you're pregnant? You have children. The point that I'm trying to get across is those are considered children in the womb. Our society, a lot of people in society think that that which is in the womb is not human and can be disregarded. Here's what God sees as He looks into the womb. In fact, look at verse 21. Rebekah conceived, verse 22, and there were children struggling together within her. She had twins within her, and they're described as children. That's how God views the unborn. They're children. And notice verse 21 says she conceived. You find this over and over and over again throughout the Scriptures from Genesis, throughout the rest of the Bible, both Old and New, that when it says she conceived, that conception is the beginning point of human life. That is always considered the beginning point. And scientifically, it is by those scientists who look at the evidence. Quote after quote can be given from professors and scientists and biologists who say that from a strictly scientific point of view or a biological point of view, life begins at conception. Well, the Bible said that all along, thousands of years before scientists were able to investigate it further. So conception is the beginning point, and from that point on, it's a child just in different stages of development. That's all it is. It's a human child, whether you call it a zygote, whether you call it an embryo, a fetus, whatever you want to call it, it is a human child from conception, just in different stages of development. We could go on that one. But I think it's a good point to bring out, and this is a good verse to bring out to people, how Moses, writing by inspiration, this is what he says about the unborn. They're children. They are children in her womb. Verse 22, but the children struggled together within her, and she says, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went and inquired of the Lord. And here's the Lord's response to her. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. The one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now, in the normal course of things in that society, the younger serves the older. The firstborn has the blessing. The firstborn is like the ruler of the family. the inheritor of all that is coming to him when the father dies. And so he is kind of set up as the ruler. But in this situation, it says, God says, the older shall serve the younger. And we're going to see how that plays out between Jacob and Esau. And this is what he's talking about here. Jacob and Esau are in her womb. And two nations are in those people, potentially, genetically, potentially, within Jacob and Esau. And through Jacob would come the nation of Israel. And through Esau would come the Edomites. And you read throughout biblical history, they are always in conflict with one another. The Edomites and Israel are always in conflict with one another. There's a strife there that begins quite literally in the womb. So there is a problem there between those two descendants, the Edomites, Esau's descendants, and Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. You can read about that struggle in Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 21, or the prophet Obadiah, where God pronounces judgment upon the Edomites. That small one-chapter book in the prophets, Obadiah, speaks about the judgment that he is going to bring upon the Edomite people because of how they treated their brother, he calls them in the book of Obadiah, Israel. So here you have two children in the womb of Rebekah, and these two children would be the ancestors of two nations. One would be the one that would bring about the Messiah, and that would be, of course, Jacob, whose name would be changed to Israel later on in his life. Verse 24. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Verse 25. Now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment, and they called him Esau. So here you have Esau. He is red. That he is a hairy individual, very hairy individual, and this will be characteristic of his lifestyle later on. He's going to be a person that you would call an outdoorsman. So from the very womb, he's got this distinctiveness about him. In fact, Esau's name means hairy, and Edom, it is believed, means red. That's where the term Edom comes from, red. Verse 26, afterwards, as she gives birth to, now notice this, Esau is born first. They're technically born at the same time, but Esau is born first. He would be the firstborn in chronological order. Verse 26, afterwards his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so that his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. So here you have the baby Jacob holding on to the heel of Esau as he was in the process of being born. And the word Jacob means literally one who takes by the heel or supplanter. One who supplants, one who takes by the heel. So he would be someone who supplants, and that name is going to be carried out in his life when you see what he does concerning the birthright a little bit later on in their lives. So at the very beginning you see a struggle there. Quite literally from the word go, Israel and Esau are struggling. And there's going to be a conflict with them throughout pretty much the rest of their life. Towards the end of their life, there will be somewhat of a reconciliation. But for the most part, there's going to be some problems with these two brothers. Verse 27. The boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. So verse 27 tells us about even though they're twins, they're obviously not identical twins. And being, even though they're twins and not being identical, they're about as different in their personalities as they are in their appearance. Esau is what you would call an outdoorsman. He's a hunter. He's a tough guy. He's out there in the field. He's killing the animals and such. And we're going to see later on, he's a rather impulsive individual. He will make rash decisions that he will not be able to take back later on, even though he wishes he could. Jacob was more of a homebody. He stayed in the tents. He was very close to his mom. Some would even call him a mama's boy. Kind of soft, so to speak. So there's a very different personality there, even among these two men who are twins. Verse 28, now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So here you even see a favoritism between the parents. That always causes problems in a family. Anytime you have one parent favoring one child and another parent favoring another, that will always cause problems within a family. So you have Isaac. It doesn't mean that Isaac didn't love Jacob, but he had an attachment to Esau. It says in verse 28, because he had a taste of game. In other words, he was an outdoorsman and would go out and kill animals and fix this food, and this will come into play later on as we see this unfolding. So Isaac had an attachment to him. Perhaps Isaac was this type of individual, rugged outdoorsman type. And so Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob probably stayed very close to Rebekah, and as a result, she favored Jacob. Verse 29, when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and was famished. Verse 30, and Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of the stew, for I am famished. Therefore, his name was called Edom. The stew there is a type of lentil, a pea-like soup made from pods, and it was reddish brown. And so, according to this is why he is called Edom. Edom means red. And so, this is kind of how the other name of Esau came about, Edom. So he came in, he's famished, he's some translations might say he's starving, he wants something to eat. And here you see the attitude of Jacob. Not a very respectable attitude he had. He said in verse 31, instead of helping his brother, he said, Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. Now that was something that was very, very sacred to have a birthright. Esau was technically the first one born. Therefore, having the birthright, he would inherit a great deal of things and inherit the blessing from Isaac. And it would be supposed that through him, this promise that God made to Abraham would pass through him and his family. But it wasn't God's intent for that to happen. And even though Jacob is being, I guess you could call it mean and unkind to his brother, it would be through Jacob that the seed line and the inheritance would continue. It does not excuse Jacob's attitude. He should have been willing to help his brother, But he said, first sell me your birthright. Verse 32, Esau said, behold, I am about to die. So what use then is my birthright to me? Verse 33, and Jacob said, first swear to me. And he swore to him and sold his birthright. That was something that just was not done. That was an insult to the family to do that. And so you probably see a struggle here, even though it's not given in a whole lot of detail, between Jacob and Esau pretty much all throughout their life. And so Jacob is saying here, I want to have that birthright. I want to have that right. And he swore to him, and in that period of time, a verbal oath was just as binding legally as a document. You give a verbal oath about something, it was binding. And so he swore to him to have that birthright, and so Jacob gave him something to eat, verse 34. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. He despised it. He didn't take it seriously. Now this is why I said earlier that Esau seems to be a rather impulsive individual. It was probably most likely that Esau was not on the edge of death. He wanted something to eat and was hungry from his activity out in the field. But Jacob took advantage of Esau's shallowness, I guess you could say. Took advantage of it to get the birthright. So you see how that both of these individuals, both of these brothers aren't the best characters. But yet God is going to use them. He's going to use them to accomplish His will. And some changes will take place in them a little bit later on. Hebrews chapter 12. Right. Let me go ahead and read that again so everyone can hear it. I'm going to start out with verse 14. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. The Hebrew writer is talking here about let's not be wicked and follow the bad example of someone like Esau, even though in Hebrews chapter 11 he gave good examples of great men and women of faith. Here's a bad example. He says in verse 14, Hebrews 12, "Pursue peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled." Verse 16. "That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal." So here's God's inspired commentary on what we just read in Genesis. He's an immoral and godless person. Some translations, older translations, may say profane. He's profane. And so he's immoral, he's godless, he's an individual who despised his birthright, and he sold it for a single meal, verse 17. "For you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears." So verse 17 we haven't got to yet in our lessons in Genesis, but we will eventually get to what verse 17 is talking about. How that Esau wanted to receive the blessing of being the firstborn, but he couldn't. Sometimes there are decisions that are made or actions that are taken that can never be reversed. Never be reversed. That doesn't mean a person can't be forgiven. But there are certain actions that carry consequences with it that can never, ever be reversed. Even though Esau may have wanted that birthright and that blessing so bad that he even brought tears to his eyes, he couldn't do it. You think about a man who cheats on his wife, and the wife puts that man away, rightly so, according to New Testament teaching, for his unfaithfulness, she scripturally can remarry. He cannot. He cannot ever be married again. Now, I know in our society that's ridiculous, and among brethren that's becoming ridiculous because of the live and let live attitude that's permeating so many places. But that's the truth of the matter, and that's why Jesus talked about those who become eunuchs in Matthew chapter 19 for the kingdom of heaven's sake. They realize that they have to be celibate for the rest of their life because of the consequences of sin. And now when you teach this, people say, oh, you're saying a person can't be forgiven. I'm not saying that at all. That person that I just gave in that illustration, that husband can be forgiven and go to heaven. He just can't be married ever again. I mean, that's God's will on the matter. The only person that is authorized to get married again is the person who's innocent, the innocent spouse. He or she can remarry with God's approval. The one who has cheated cannot. And that can't be reversed. But that person can go to heaven if they live faithfully to the Lord. But that action, the point I'm trying to make is certain actions are irreversible. I mean, you go out here and you get drunk, and you go out here behind the wheel of an automobile, and you run over somebody and kill them. That is something that cannot ever be reversed. Now, that drunk, if he repents, can be forgiven. But he can't reverse what he did. That's why we have to be wise in what we do. That's why the Bible talks about not being hasty in making decisions. Don't make impulsive decisions. That's exactly what Esau did. He made an impulsive decision. He thought in his own mind, oh, I'm about to starve to death. What good is the birthright anyway if I'm going to die? And so Jacob was willing to take advantage of that situation. Now, I'm not saying Jacob was right in what he did, but he took advantage of Esau's basic rash attitude, his willingness to make rash decisions. There have been people who have made split-second rash decisions that have ended other people's lives in a fit of anger, a fit of rage. So we need to understand that that's why the Bible over and over again in the New Testament talks about being sober-minded. Think clearly. Think before you act. Think before you speak. And so Esau is an example of that. Certain things cannot be undone. Think about King David. Throughout the rest of his life, after his adultery with Bathsheba, Nathan said, your sin is forgiven, but the sword shall never depart from your house. You're going to have problems for the rest of your life. And you read David's life, and he did. So there are certain things that carry consequences that we need to let people know that there are decisions that need to be made very carefully and very thoughtfully, and not just make them like Esau did. Mm-hmm. Right.
He said that this he believed is where he found no chance to repent was that Isaac would not change his mind because he blessed Jacob.
Right.
He would not repent when it was blessed.
Exactly. That Isaac did bless Jacob, and there was no reversing of that. That's a good point. Wayne Jackson's writings are very good. I'd recommend them to anyone. You could see the stuff that he writes on. You go to our website and go to our link page. Christian Courier is on that link page, and Wayne Jackson's an excellent student of the Bible. Numbers 5:19. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at that. Numbers 5:19 says, the priest shall have her take an oath and shall say to the woman, if no man is lain with you, and if you have not gone astray in an uncleanness, being under the authority of your husband, be immune to this water of bitterness that brings a curse. Verse 20, if you, however, have gone astray, being under the authority of your husband, and if you have defiled yourself, and a man other than your husband had intercourse with you, verse 21 says, then the priest shall have the woman swear by an oath, and goes on talking about the consequences. I think in principle it would, talking about consequences of actions. I don't really know the context of that right now, but from this reading a few verses there, it seems like that that he is talking about sin and consequences. Anything else about chapter 25 of Genesis before we get into chapter 26 very briefly? Now, chapter 26 verses 1 through 11, it is believed these events in the life of Isaac and Rebekah take place before Jacob and Esau are born. In other words, sometimes the Bible does not go in chronological order in certain things. It is believed that verses 1 through 11, his dealings with Abimelech, there's no mention of the children here, and so it is believed that Moses is kind of giving some background material that will lead up to the importance of the birthright, the importance of why the inheritance was so important to Jacob and should have been important to Esau. When you study the book of Genesis, you see this before. Genesis chapter 1 talks about the creation of man and woman, Genesis 1:26. But Moses in Genesis chapter 2 goes back and talks about details concerning the creation of man and woman. Now, keep in mind there were no chapter and verse divisions, but Moses goes back and gives more detail. So, it is believed this is what's going on here. It says in verse 1, now there was a famine in the land beside the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. There was a famine in the days of Abraham. Here comes another famine. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. This may have been the son of the Abimelech that Abraham knew. Sometimes names were just passed down through the kings. The same name. The Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. So Isaac was told by God, you don't go down into Egypt. Verse 3, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. Now God is reaffirming the oath that was made to Abraham to his son Isaac. Verse 4, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and will give your descendants all the lands, and by your descendants, or your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Verse 5, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandment, my statutes, and my laws. Look at verse 5. Here's why Abraham was a great man. Here's why he's called a man of faith. He's upheld as a great man of faith in the book of Romans, in the book of James in the New Testament, and other places, the book of Hebrews. Here's why. Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. The laws here, of course, is not talking about the law of Moses. This is talking about the law of God during the patriarchal period. This is a long time before Moses is even born. So there was law for those who lived under that period of time. It was not the same type of written law that you find in the law of Moses, but there was a law, and Abraham was obedient. That's why he was a man of faith. He did what was right according to God's will. So the same promise and the affirmation of him being multiplied and becoming a great nation, and through him all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, talking about the coming of Christ, was given, passed down from Abraham, and is passed down to Isaac. It says verse 6, so Isaac lived in Gerar. Verse 7, then the men of the place asked about his wife and he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. Does that sound familiar? Like father, like son. Like father, like son. We have to understand that not only our good examples can be passed down, but our bad examples can be passed down to our children. Here you have Isaac lying, just like Abraham lied. And it's very interesting, as a whole in Abraham's life, verse 5 summed up his life. He obeyed and kept my charge, my commandments, and my statutes, and my laws, but Abraham had a problem with lying. And if we're not careful, we will pass down those characteristics by our example down to our children. And that's what happened here. Isaac is following a bad example of his father, and he lied and said, she is my sister. Where do you think he came up with that? Do you think he just pulled that out of the sky? He knew his father Abraham did it. So he thought he was going to get away with it. But we will continue the study here, and we're going to see, how it parallels the life of Abraham in this situation. We'll continue with this next week, Lord willing.